So I'm here to give you a personal take on the process of using data to inform your decisions, something we like to call closing the loop, which is kind of a jargony term to basically say finish the whole assessment process. Once you have your data, your analysis of the data, and kind of your main findings, actually put them into practice. Use them in your context to hopefully better what your organization does. Now, this might sound like a really straightforward idea, something that, sure, that's probably the reason that we do assessment. That really rounds out the entire purpose behind assessment. But a surprising amount of folks don't actually do this. It's fairly common for maybe assessment partners or assessment offices, depending on the context, to work with partners around the university, go through the whole assessment process, and then get to the point where maybe there's a deliverable of some kind, maybe a report, or even if it's just a brief meeting talking about the main findings or the answers to the questions that the assessment project really interrogated. But after that, it just often ends up in just kind of this general assessment ether, and it's never to be found again. Maybe the report lies on the shelf. Maybe it goes unread by most of the folks. Maybe there's kind of a check mark beside, hey, we did our assessment process this year, and that's great, and that's what we're supposed to do, but we didn't actually change anything. So there's probably a variety of reasons why this kind of thing happens. One, I think, is that we don't often, or maybe not as much as we should, talk about how units or organizations are going to use the data when everything's finished. How are the answers to the questions we're asking at the beginning of the assessment process actually going to inform our practice? Now, and I'm using kind of this different vernacular too. Data-informed decisions is a different approach than data-driven decisions, in the sense that informed decisions still allows you the choice to make a change or not. So it's not necessary that change has to happen for this to be a successful assessment project, but certainly having an openness to change is probably a requirement for a successful assessment project. So this idea of closing the loop, really, it's important to bring up at the very, very beginning. Say I'm looking at how maybe a job fair is connecting with the various demographic groups on campus. If this is a concern for the folks running the job fair, then ideally we would talk at the very beginning of the assessment process that what if we find that some demographic groups are overrepresented at this job fair and some are underrepresented? What will we do then? So even before you've given the assessment project, even before you've distributed any surveys, done observations, whatever it is, the idea of what will we do with this data, how will we use it, is already on the table. And so that is probably the first step to making the closing the loop process a lot easier, maybe to allow it to happen more often. Being able to think through this idea of, say, okay, we have white students who are overrepresented at the job fair. What are the implications of that? Well, that might mean that students of color are not having the same kind of opportunity within the career market around the university as white students are. If that's the case, that probably means that we should go and reach out specifically to students of color, advertise, work our networks and connections to try to make sure that students of color are well represented at a job fair, for example. Now, that conversation can happen very conceptually at the very beginning of the process. And then, when the end of the assessment cycle comes around, after a little while, whatever it takes, and you've got a report, you've got some findings, then it's a lot easier to move into, okay, let's kind of move this through. There's some probably hurdles and obstacles to this idea, though, in the sense that sometimes assessment is a really critical part of an organization's understanding of how they do what they do, but it's also something that is above and beyond maybe their typical work. And so even when assessment findings come back, it's something that would require so many more conversations that maybe there's not a lot of time for. Maybe the organization is still trying to do just this normal, typical week of work, and so trying to go back and critically evaluate, and is this going well? Is this doing what we want it to do? Is maybe something that happens above and beyond a typical weeks of work. Of course, we can evaluate that and say whether that's right or wrong, but that's probably the reality of a lot of folks' situations. Also, the process of using data to inform decisions requires continued collaboration between the assessment folks and those folks who are partnering in assessment, or however that looks. I've seen several situations in my professional experience of really great reports, really well done data analyses given to practitioners who are maybe less aware of how some of these things function, or how some of the language, maybe statistical language, works in the context of that report. And so there's this report, and it looks great, and maybe it's designed great, and maybe it finds really cool things, and maybe there's some interesting takeaways that really should affect an organization's practice. But if that's not interpretable to the folks for whom it matters the most, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. And so there's continued need for assessment practitioners to really be as transparent as possible throughout that process, and still think about partnering with folks in that process to use data to inform decisions. And I know that we think of it as a loop, as kind of a continual circle. I think maybe it will be helpful for us to think of this idea of like a spiral, almost, a spring, this idea of, as you're working through the end of the assessment process, if there's a shift in the organization because the organization used the results to apply and change within the practices, then there's a change of trajectory, and then a continued, hopefully, upward trajectory, continuous improvement. So this is just maybe a little bit more of an informal discussion, some more ideas about closing the loop, and there you'll see a number of different ideas about other things in the process of using data to inform decisions within the context of this module. But here's maybe a little bit of context for you within that process. So, of course, very important within the assessment process to keep this in mind from the very beginning and probably throughout the whole cycle. It really gives us purpose in the assessment work that we do, something that is essential. And even though it sounds like it should be straightforward, it may not happen as often as we would like, or as it should. So keep this in mind as you're going throughout the assessment process, and best of luck as you try to close the loop in your assessment circles.